within certain scenarios, what would make a good person good, what would make a person bad?
I've got no idea.
Yeah, I mean, it's a horribly complex question. But I think that if one can look towards certain things that would be indicators of maybe goodness or badness. And I get what you're saying about how if you abstract it thousands, infinite number of times, if you abstract it all the way to the very beginning, one could see that we are determined in certain ways. We're determined to do and think, etc., in certain ways. And so if you understand the entire history of a person and all the things that influences them, then of course they'll make the decision that they made, whether you see it as a good or a bad decision.
But that thought is non-conclusive. Whether free will exists or not, your action shouldn't change. If you were predetermined to kill that baby, let's say, me thinking of you being predetermined to kill that baby, I'm also predetermined to think of that.
Yeah.
So I'm not in a different layer.
I know. I'm not saying this is a different layer. I'm just saying that if the person was predetermined to kill that baby, then if they didn't have agency, because I think that it ultimately comes down to agency, whether somebody's good or bad in doing something. If somebody killed that baby, yet they had absolutely no agency to do so, like they necessarily had to kill the baby and they necessarily had to like killing the baby, then how can we blame them? If there was no way that they could have done anything else and they had to do it.
Okay, what if I blamed him? Would you consider my blaming him bad?
If we're going off the fact that you also necessarily had to blame him because he necessarily had to do that.
No, I knew your point. He's predetermined. I shouldn't be blaming him. And I still blame him. I don't care about your point. I understand it. I agree with it. But I still want to feel the suffering in either person. Would I be doing something bad? You are only pointing out to moral nihilism with this.
One could definitely do that. One could still definitely blame somebody who's done something bad, who was predetermined to do that, who is everything conspired to make them necessarily want to do that. You could still blame them. And honestly, they still don't have a place within society because they're doing something that's not good. But saying about whether the action is good or bad, saying that things could have been done a different way when they actually couldn't have. One could do something necessarily and still be put in jail for it. That's just kind of my own intuition on the matter. Because if they don't fit within society and they're doing horrible, evil things that are hurting a lot of people, even though they necessarily had to do those things, they couldn't have done anything else, then I think it's still all right to blame them, still all right to put them in a jail and keep them out of society because they can't do these things whilst living within a society, regardless if they are necessarily doing them or not. You see what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I think that you could blame them totally. You could do whatever you want to them. But as to whether or not what you're doing is good or bad or justified, it'd be under the same argument of you necessarily blamed them for what they necessarily did. So you can't impose a value on what your blaming means when you still can't impose value on what their killing the baby was. It's neither positive nor negative in both instances.
But you're neither. The analysis that you're doing is also necessary. You're necessarily analyzing the guy doing something necessary and the other one blaming him.
I mean, exactly. But that's the point, though, is that regardless of what you do, if it's necessary, you can't ascribe a positive or negative thing on it. It's whether or not do they fit within a society, and this is the only society that exists. Say it's necessary that this society exists, and it's necessary that it exists in a certain way. Then he necessarily did something, and you necessarily blamed him. You can't ascribe a positive or negative value on any of it. Say there was a different society. Say the society was built upon people enjoying murder. We've used this example in the past. And I don't know why it's always so grim, our examples, but they're easy examples to use, I think.
Yeah.
But say the society necessarily exists that a society enjoys murder, which is contradictory because that society just wouldn't be able to survive because everybody would just be murdering everybody. So it wouldn't be able to survive. But let's just say it does. There's a society that exists and they love murdering. Then somebody who doesn't like murdering, they wouldn't fit within that society. Just like the person who loves murdering doesn't fit within the society who doesn't like murdering. It's in the same way. But you still can't ascribe a good or a bad value onto those things if they necessarily happen.
But is that conclusive? Can you derive any practical actions from the conclusion you gave here?
I mean, that's a whole different question entirely. Practicality in regard to, a belief system where everything is necessarily determined. Because even if you believe that everything's determined, you still have to make actions in a certain way. One of the better arguments for free will is just that we feel it, we do it, we have to make decisions. But yet, it doesn't necessarily, well, not necessarily, it doesn't really matter that much, because you could do things, you can make decisions, and you're never going to be able to see all the entirety of all the influences upon you when you make a decision. But yet you still make a decision. And then you look back and see that you were actually determined to make that decision. But in the process of making a decision, regardless of whatever you believe, if you have free will or you're determined, you'll never be able to see all the influences upon you. So you'll make a decision regardless. And then once you look back on it, then you'll be able to see, all right, I was determined to make the decision by this, this, and this.
I think that in the same way that we cannot prove that this is a simulation, it might be, I don't know, but I'm not able to prove it one way or the other, it is inconclusive. Free will, okay, it might not exist. I'm 100% with you. I don't think free will can exist when you consider the absolute existence of atoms in the universe and their relationship. I don't know how you could compute that apart from the universe, so you could avoid affecting it, so you could predict it. It is not possible to do that by definition, because if you are part of the universe, you cannot compute it without affecting it. Well, never mind. So the thing is that it is not conclusive. It's an interesting thought, but there's no way it could change your actions. And if it is not practically going to affect reality, what worth is in it?
What do you mean?
Is it valuable at all? Is that thought...
What is valuable? The thought, the belief in determinism, or everything's determined?
For example, why is that valuable at all?
I mean, it might not be, I don't know. Because if you have to make a decision and you believe everything is determined, how do you make a decision based off of the belief that everything is determined? Because you still have to make decisions. You can't just be like, all right, I necessarily have to make a decision. It's once you make the decision that it's necessarily going to happen. So, but not every belief needs to be entirely 100% practical. You know, you could believe that atoms make up everything and still it has no import on your life whatsoever. It doesn't matter to you at all, actually. Same with molecules, same with blood running through your body until you've lost enough of it. It doesn't matter. It doesn't really matter to you whether or not you believe it or not. It's the same thing with determinism and free will. You're still going to be doing things based off of these beliefs. It doesn't have to have some sort of practical import to your life.
I wasn't implying that my thoughts were relevant in a way. My thoughts are mostly irrelevant and non-applicable to life. So I was just trying to see if you were capable of thinking of it as being practical, because I was thinking of it as not being practical, but you agree with me that it is not practical.
Yeah, if you live from moment to moment thinking everything's determined and it's like it just consumes you, then I think you still can make decisions based off of that belief. So I don't think it matters whether you believe it or not. I don't think it matters like as to whether or not it's practical and you can live your life whilst believing it. Totally. It doesn't seem to have much import.
So if it is not applicable to real life, the thought that you were implying that there's not actual moral standard that should be followed due to determinism, because that person killing the baby was determined, is neutralized.
Well, I think that you still could have a moral standard that should be followed within society.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. It's like, but then even the thoughts that produce that moral standard weren't determined. They weren't necessarily determined. But maybe they were determined for a reason. Maybe they were determined because they're creating a more survivable society or something like that. Like go back to the example with the society that loves murdering. They wouldn't be able to exist, and they don't exist because they like murdering. You see what I mean? And so we exist because we don't like murdering. We exist because we enjoy living, or just something to that effect. We tolerate living, etc., etc. Ideally enjoy living, but I mean, it depends on the person. So yeah, it could be determined that we live in a society which likes living because there's no other way. If we didn't like living, we wouldn't be around. And so our laws, if they are to exist and if we are to continue existing, they will be in that same trend. They'll trend towards living and maybe an increase in health or an increase in the quality of living that we have, which leads to more living, etc., etc. Or maybe we all collectively just start disliking life.
But that doesn't inherently point out to the good doing of your acts, that only points out to the existence of your acts.
Yeah.
And the existence of your acts don't inherently have a good being of them. What about the other infinite potential acts that could have been achieved or could have happened but didn't? Are those morally less worthy of considering than yours? I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, that brings into a whole different, it's a difficult dimension to bring into it, morality, when you're talking about determinism. Because with determinism, I think that most things are neither positive nor negative. It's more or less just indifferent. But it's so tough because it's where do you separate the two? At what point can you change yourself to be a good or a bad person if everything is entirely determined?